Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at Morphy's with a fully transferable M14. Pretty rare thing to come across. And today I want to talk about the M14, where it came from and what it is, and then what the heck happened to it, because the reputation of the M14 is pretty dismal, especially today. But it's not a rifle. You look at this and you may argue whether this was the right sort of rifle to choose in the 1950s, but there's nothing obvious about the M14 that says it should be a failed program. Like, should have gone fine, so why didn't it? What led to this horrible reputation today? But let's begin with part one. Where did the M14 come from? During World War II, the US had, of course, the M1 Garand, and there were really no significant changes made to it over the course of the war. Unlike Germany, who was constantly adopting newer, better, fancier rifles, the US picked a winner and just stuck with it. But that doesn't mean that nobody was tinkering with the rifle, because back at Springfield Armory, throughout the course of the war, there were something like 14 different experimental versions of the M1 made to test different things that they might want to introduce. There was a paratrooper version they tested. There were muzzle brakes. By the end of the war, they were experimenting with box magazine fed select fire versions of the M1. And in fact, a rifle of that sort was approved for production right at the end of the war and then canceled because the war ended. But when the war comes to a close, the US Army has this idea in mind of what it wants to get. It wants to replace the M1s. It wants a rifle that is lighter, it wants a rifle that is capable of selective fire, and it basically wants to standardize all of the major platforms, 4 specifically major platforms, into one platform. So they want to take the M1 Carbine, the M1 Garand, the M3 Grease Gun, or M3A1 Grease Gun by that point, and the 1918A2 BAR, and standardize them into one platform. And that's going to be the M14 infantry rifle and the M15 light machine gun. Essentially, the M15 is an M14 with a heavier barrel and a bipod and a pistol grip. It's going to replace the BAR as a support weapon. Now, it's also, I think, relevant to point out that at this point they were also planning on like a shorter version of the M14 with a folding stock that would be a better replacement for the Grease Gun and the M1 Carbine than the full-length rifle, but those plans got scrapped very quickly. And I think it's easy to ridicule this idea of how are you going to have one rifle take over the job of everything from a support machine gun to a PDW, but it's worth noting that the AR-15 essentially has done that. The US Marine Corps has the M27 IAR, which is basically an AR-15 pushed into the squad support weapon role. And then there were lots of carbine versions of the AR-15 made, all the way down to, you can look at like the survival rifles, the little tiny short-barreled carbines that were put together in the 60s. Like, that's the same concept here. So it's not like this concept was impossible, but it certainly wasn't going to go easily. Now, in order to accomplish this new thing, Springfield started working on a couple of its own designs, as did other rifle companies. Remington and Winchester in particular developed prototypes for the new Army rifle, and we'll cover those eventually, specifically addressing each one, but the short version is neither of those ever got anywhere. Neither of those companies were successful. Springfield had a couple of programs in-house, had T25, the T28, the T31, one of them, the T20. So the T20 was essentially an upgraded M1 Garand. The T25 was a rifle designed by a guy named Earl Harvey, who was a Springfield engineer. He was a talented designer. He'd worked on some M1 experimental stuff. He actually had a hand in some of what went into the M14, but he developed a tilting bolt rifle that was looking pretty good, but by the early 1950s, by like 1953, it just wasn't doing well enough in trials against foreign competitors, which is to say the FN FAL, and it ended up getting dropped. There was the, the T31 was a John Garand really weird bullpup that totally deserves its own video, totally unrelated to the M1 Garand. It's a funky, weird gun. We'll cover that separately. The T28 was actually based on the German G43. It was a roller delayed or roller locked gun. I, off the top of my head, don't recall which. It didn't go very far either. By 1953, well, 1949, the T44 comes into development. So Springfield's continually working on a couple of these projects. T44 is the designation for the upgraded M1 Garand by that point. And a lot of these, by the way, are still being built on old T20 receivers, some of which date back to World War II. This isn't their high priority project. Their high priority one is Earl Harvey's T25, which by 53 doesn't work out, and they kind of look to, well, crap, that's not going to work. We need something else. Here at Springfield, we have to have a good contender in the trials, and so that's when they really shift focus to the T44. This was first came under this designation in 1949. They keep working on it. Originally there's the T44 and the T44E1. The E1 is the heavy barreled version, which would eventually go on to become the M15 rifle, which then got canceled. There are a couple trials. The final one is held in the summer of 1956 at Fort Benning, Georgia, and it's the T44 versus the T48, which is the FN FAL. And ultimately, that test actually, the conclusion is that both rifles are acceptable. And it'll take basically another year before someone is willing to make the bold, bureaucratic move of actually picking a winner. And probably not surprisingly, the winner is the T44. Now, there are some objective reasons to lean towards the T44 instead of the FAL. In retrospect, it doesn't really appear to have been the best decision to make, but at the time, the T44, of course, does have the we made it ourselves at home advantage, which is something that is always appealing to everybody. It's also a gun that is lighter, it has fewer parts, it has a lot of similarities to the M1 Garand, which are marketed essentially as they'll lead to, it'll be easier to manufacture because we already have some of the tooling. That didn't really work out, but one can understand where the argument comes from, and also the argument that it'll be simpler to train troops on. The sights, the trigger, there are a lot of similarities between this and the M1 Garand. Guys who've trained on the Garand, it'll be easy for them to pick up this. That's another argument that gets made a lot and also kind of doesn't make that much sense because usually there are very few troops who actually switch rifles when you adopt something new. Generally speaking, the next class of recruits gets the new rifle, and so that's what they train on. Anyway, this is chosen. May 1st, 1957 is formally adopted as the rifle US caliber 30 M14. What we know today as the M14 is specifically the T44E4, the final update of the T44 program. And fundamentally, it is an M1 Garand system that has been modified to be fully automatic or selective fire. This is a selective fire switch here. That's auto, push it in and rotate. That's semi-auto. It has a 20-round box magazine. And it has a redesigned new gas system. Just like the M1 Garand, all the markings are here on the heel of the receiver. This is US rifle 7.62mm M14. This particular one was manufactured by the H&R, Harrington and Richardson Arms Company, and a serial number. First, let me talk about the magazine a bit. Holds 20 rounds, and this is actually a magazine that was derived from John Garand's T31 bullpup. Interestingly, it's the only thing about that bullpup rifle that ever made it into an actual service product, but it is a nose-in rockback magazine. It does not actually have a lip on the front, it has a hole on the front, and the recoil spring guide rod acts as the front magazine catch. You'll see that when we pull it apart. It does have a manual hold, or an automatic hold open right there, so when the gun is empty, it does lock open. You can refill it via 5-round stripper clip. There was an experimental 10-round clip that didn't go into production, but you can use standard 5-round stripper clips there to refill the magazine while it's still in the gun. The lever that was a clip release in the M1 is a manual bolt hold open lever, bolt lock lever in the M14. The full auto system on the M14 is a little bit sort of kludgy here. This is semi-auto. When I push this in and rotate it around, you can see I have the letter A. That indicates automatic. When you see the A, the gun's in automatic mode. And the way this works is that this bar on the outside of the gun will actually move forward and back. So if I'm in full auto, I'm going to fire the rifle and I'm going to hold the trigger down here. And what happens is The empty case ejects, it's going to chamber a new case, and then as the bolt closes, the front of the operating rod right there hits the front hook on this full auto trip lever, and it's going to go just slightly forward. This pulls forward, which acts as the auto sear. I'll show you the internal bit in a moment, but that last bit of travel right there releases the hammer to fire the next round. So essentially, when this is set to semi-auto, it just doesn't move forward. It doesn't do that. A little weird that this is on the outside of the gun instead of built onto the inside, but this is essentially what they did in order to continue using the exact same fire control group as the M1 and not have to redevelop something new. The gas system here is also really interesting. This was an element in several iterations of experimental M1 Garand, but we'll get to that when we disassemble the rifle. Out at the front here, we have a nice long flash hider, bayonet lug on it, a really good front sight. The rear sight is straight off the M1. It's an aperture. It is fine click adjustable. Like, it is a fantastic rear sight. Especially for competition, but even as a service rifle sight, I think the M1/M14 sights are extremely difficult to beat. Disassembly is going to be basically just like the M1. So we're going to start with the trigger guard, pull that back and unlock it. That can take a little bit of force. And then we pivot it forward, and that allows the fire control group to drop out. Again, this is essentially identical to the M1 fire control group. Next up, we're just going to lift the action out of the stock. The stock just hooks on with this metal ferrule at the front. There's really nothing going on inside there. For what it's worth, the original M14s did not have this raised butt plate. This was an element of the M15 support weapon. When the M15 gets canceled, they put the butt plate from it onto the M14 to sort of try and give a little bit of that capacity over to the M14. Next up, we're going to remove the recoil spring. Now to do this, I actually have to pull this little locking piece out of the way. So there we go. We've got this little pin here that slides in and out, and it just locks. There we go. It locks this recoil spring guide in place. Note how this pointy thing protrudes forward. That is your front magazine catch. So when you're locking a magazine into the M14, you are hooking it onto that. If I pull this out, you can see there's the spring guide. That's your front magazine catch right there. Kind of a clever multiple, dual use for a part, really. Now, so far, this is the same as disassembling a semi-automatic M1A. At this point, however, we need to take off this auto trip lever. So what I'm going to do is I have to push this all the way forward. There we go. And then I can rotate it back and lift it off of that little peg there. So I take this off, and that will allow me to pull the bolt handle back to this point in the middle, lift the bolt handle off. There we go. Bolt handle comes off, and it's going to rotate up and come off. On an M1, this operating rod went all the way up to the gas port. On the M14, it's a bit shorter. I can then come up here and pull the bolt out of the gun, a little finicky. There we go. The distinctive element of an M14 bolt is this roller on the locking, on the running cam. So that roller is going to act in this cam here. That causes the bolt to rotate up and down. Interestingly, again, this isn't something that was designed specifically for the M14. This actually comes off of the M1E3, a World War II experiment to reduce friction on the bolt of the M1 that was successful, but deemed not important enough to revamp production to introduce during World War II. So they kind of put that on shelf. When the M14 comes out, they pull that idea back out of storage and use it. Lastly, we come to the gas system up here. And the gas system is another element that came off a World War II experiment. This was actually on several of the E-series experimental M1s. And it's a gas system that was originally developed by an inventor named White. I actually have some previous videos on the guns that White entered into the original trials that resulted in adoption of the M1. Well, he wasn't successful at first, but Earl Harvey from Springfield takes his gas system and adapts it onto the T44 here, where it gets used. And it's what's called a gas expansion and cutoff system. So we have a gas piston in here. The gas port is right here, by the way, and there is a gas cutoff. So if I can rotate this 90 degrees and just cut the gas system off entirely, if I wanted to launch rifle grenades, which they didn't really ever do on the M14, but that's set up that way. So gas port's there, and we have a piston that's sitting like this in the gun, and the front end of this plug is also hollow, so it lines up like that, essentially. Lines up like that. The inside of this piston is hollow, and the idea is when the gun fires, gas will come out of the barrel into this hole. It'll fill up the inside of this gas piston, which pushes against the gas plug. It starts moving, and it's going to cut itself off automatically. Once this gas piston fills up, moves backward, and then the port is no longer aligned with the gas port, and the rest of the movement is partially inertia and partially this hot gas that's continuing to burn and expand inside the gas piston. And the idea here is that it's a self-regulating system, so that if you have underpowered ammunition, this will stay, it'll take longer to start moving and more gas will come into the piston and it'll operate properly. If you have overpressure ammunition, well, it'll start moving faster, it'll fill up faster, and it'll cut itself off before too much gas gets in. And again, you'll have reliable operation kind of regardless of the exact loading of the ammo. This is a good concept. Maybe not actually necessary. As it turns out, it doesn't like perfectly fix problems of inconsistent ammunition, at least when it comes to accuracy. Believe me, we'll get to that in just a couple minutes. But this is one of the fundamental differences between the M14 and the M1, because the M1 had a very traditional gas piston of gas blows into front of piston, pushes it back, and the excess eventually vents off through a hole in the whole system. All right, now let's take a quick look at how the trigger mechanism actually works here. Of course, we have the standard Garand system. By the way, if this looks very similar to an AK, it's because it is. Kalashnikov was heavily influenced by the M1. We've got these two little hooks right here, which interact with these hooks on the front and back of the hammer. So if you have pulled the trigger, those two hooks have moved forward, and when the hammer comes back, it's going to lock under the rear one. When you release the trigger, then it pops to the front one. When you pull the trigger again, this goes forward. And by the way, if this looks like the French RSC 1917, it's because it is. Garand was heavily influenced by the French RSC 1917. Now, what the auto trip does here is it assumes, okay, we're holding the trigger down, so this is going to come back, the rear hook's going to catch it, and then when the bolt goes all the way forward, it's going to push this lever forward, like you saw, which pulls this little lip backward, right there. That lip just pushes this rear sear backward. So when the bolt's all the way forward, the only thing holding the hammer back is this. That gets pushed back, the hammer gets released, and it fires. So I have the trigger held back, the hammer's back, it's being held by this rear catch, and when this goes forward, boop, ow, right there, it drops the hammer, which also drops that, and hits me in the thumb. But that is how the full auto system works on the M14. Early in 1958, the search begins to find, hopefully, 2 civilian contractors to manufacture the M14 for the Army. Now, Springfield Armory had done the development on the rifle. They'd built the trials guns, but Springfield was not supposed to be a primary manufacturer of the rifle. The way Springfield Armory is supposed to work is that they do the R&D, and then they develop the technical data package for the rifle. And that's a lot of information for a gun like this. In fact, there's a picture of just the final product laid out. This is not, people think of blueprints and they think, oh, you know, it's a 1 page of blueprint for every part, so there's, I don't know, 50 parts, so it's 50 pages, boom, that's what you need to make the rifle. Not so much. Because in order to produce this on a true production line, you need to know, for example, what machine do you use to make every individual cut on the gun? So, you know, I want to cut out the inside slot on the stripper clip guide. What machine do I use? Okay. What steel am I making this stripper clip guide out of? How do I heat treat that steel? What's the initial, like what type of block of raw material do I bring in? Is it a round bar? Is it a square bar? Is it a sheet? What cutting tool do I use in the machine to cut it? What's the speed of the tool that I need to use? How fast do I move the part when I'm making this cut? And repeat that for every single part. On top of that, what's the tolerance? You know, can this particular cut be plus or minus 1/10,000th of an inch? Or can we afford to have it plus or minus 5/100ths of an inch? And then making sure that all of those tolerances interact properly so that any part off of the production line can fit on any rifle. This is a really significant process, and it will take Springfield from the date of adoption of the rifle almost 2 full years to complete it. Now, get back to where I was. The purpose here is Springfield does all of that work. They develop a pilot production line, they make all the jigs, they make the tooling, they do all the data calculations, and then they're in a position to present that to a civilian contractor. So Springfield does that hard upfront work so that a contractor can essentially, in theory, just pick up the technical data package, read what they're supposed to do, and just make guns. This theory makes a lot of sense. So in 1958, they start looking for civilian contractors. They find 2. Winchester is the low bidder. They bid like $68 and change on the rifle. Spoiler, by the way, by the time production ceases in end of 1964, the average cost per rifle will be $105 and change. So Winchester is taking a huge loss on this contract, and it's only a contract to make 35,000 guns. It's essentially a test contract. Like, let's see if you can do this. They want 2, though. They find a second company that's also willing to, they bid higher, but they're willing to do the job at Winchester's price when it's presented to them that way. And that's H&R, Harrington and Richardson. So these are both well-established gun companies. They have both manufactured, or in the case of H&R, I think almost were very recently manufacturing M1 Garands. It's a similar rifle. They should have no trouble with it. Springfield's first 50 official standard M14 rifles come off of their pilot production line in August of 1959, and then Springfield's able to disseminate that technical info and everything to Winchester and to H&R so that they can get started making guns. And they do, and the problems begin very quickly. So by the time there are 35,000 or so rifles delivered from both companies combined, that's about half of each contract, there are problems with bolt lugs shearing off. There are occasional problems with receivers breaking in half when the guns are fired. Like, these are significant problems. And 35,000 and change rifles are essentially interned for inspection. And they find there are significant heat treating problems. Something like 7,000 bolts out of those 35,000 rifles are found to be incorrectly heat treated and at risk of shearing locking lugs. So all that stuff has to be remanufactured. This is indicative of significant quality control problems with the manufacturer, which I suspect stems in part from the fact that these companies both massively underbid the guns in order to get contracts. They were hoping, of course, to get the really big contracts down the line where they could, I don't know, recoup the money that they put out to get started on them. Now, eventually, the critical quality control issues in manufacturing are fixed. Springfield is doing a lot more hand-holding and on-site inspection of Winchester and H&R than was originally intended, but they get the critical issues. And the next thing that comes up is accuracy problems. Now, the accuracy standard for the M14, I think, will shock most people today at how truly lax it is. It started off as you had to get 5 shots at 100 yards with an extreme spread of not more than 6.1 inches, a 6 MOA rifle. Now they did shrink that a little bit, and it became 5.6 inches. But an accuracy standard of 5.6 inches at 100 yards, which most people will look at and say, like, if my rifle shot 5.6 inches, that's garbage. Like, I'd never accept that. Well, that's the acceptable level, and a whole lot of these guns were not making that standard of accuracy. Now, part of this turns out to be problems, again, with manufacturing, with the inspection, with the quality control. So a few of the issues that came up when rifles were inspected en masse were loose gas plugs, loose operating rods, op rods that were rubbing against the stock, non-concentric internal machining of the flash hiders. So instead of having a nice perfect cone that the bullet comes out into in the flash hider, the flash hiders were non-standard. And so they were putting odd non-standard forces on bullets. The gas pressure coming out around the bullet was deflecting it in unpredictable ways. Look at that, can't even stand up on a wooden block. Occasionally, a few rifles actually were having bullet strikes on the flash hiders. That obviously doesn't do anything for the accuracy of the gun. Part of this you can't actually ascribe to the guns themselves because the ammunition was also having problems at that point, with a large study finding the average 90-shot group, the average group size for just the ammunition fired out of a test bench, essentially, was 3.6 inches. And some batches of ammunition were up to 5-inch dispersions. So if you're trying to shoot 5.6-inch groups, but your ammunition is already, like if you hold the gun perfectly, the ammo gives you 5 inches, well, that doesn't give you a lot of play with the rifle's accuracy to stay within 5.6. So quality control problems with the rifles were compounded by inconsistency in the ammunition. The Marine Corps, of course, is getting these guns later than the Army because that's how the Marine Corps works. They always get the good stuff last. The Marine Corps decides to, like, maybe we'll do some of our own testing before we adopt this thing, somewhat to the Army's chagrin. The Marine Corps sets out, they take 250 rifles pulled at random and have 250 troops qualify with them. A range of guys, some new conscripts or new privates, some guys who are really good, experienced marksmen, but this group of 250, 98% of them qualified with the M1. They hand them M14s, 60% of them qualify. So there's clearly something going on here, and it's not the soldiers themselves. A follow-up Marine Corps test was to just take a standard 300-meter Type D target, which is sort of a silhouette, stick it out at 300 yards, well, at 300 yards. It's a 19 by 26-inch black silhouette, and they just wanted 10 consecutive hits in the black, anywhere in the black. And 50% of the rifles that they tried could not do that. Now, interestingly, all of the Springfield manufactured ones did. It was only Winchester and H&R guns that failed that particular test. And since I mentioned it, Springfield wasn't supposed to be producing these guns in significant quantity, but in part because they were the most effective manufacturer of them, they kept getting more orders. You know, it was supposed to be just a couple thousand to start up, but then they get another one, and then they get another one. And then it's like, well, you know, we're still waiting for deliveries because Winchester and H&R have to get their stuff squared away. So in the meantime, let's just get another batch from Springfield. Springfield ends up producing like 167,000 M14s over the course of the, 5 years that they were in production. So, major accuracy problems. These are also slowly starting to be resolved. A lot of work goes into this, but at this point, let's say we've hit like 1962 at this point. Now the Air Force is looking at buying guns. The Air Force doesn't need a lot of rifles. There's, airfield security and that sort of thing. And the Air Force looks at the M14 and goes, I don't think we want to get involved in that. And that is when Curtis LeMay famously purchases the first military batch of AR-15s, starting what would be a trend of, well, the M14 just has all of these problems. Now, in total, 1.38 million M14s are produced by the end of 1964, when the project is officially canceled. These were the rifles that were first deployed to Vietnam. First group of American troops goes into Vietnam in 1965. Standard big army troops, not special forces advisors. And they're carrying M14s, but that's not going to last very long. The AR-15 will take over. for a number of reasons, partly because of the problems with the M14, but also partly because, to be fair, the M14 was designed for like open land warfare in Western Europe. It's World War II European theater all over again, not World War II Pacific theater, we're tromping through a jungle. Tromping through a jungle, you're better off with something a little bit shorter than an M14. So ultimately, the M14 would end up being the US service rifle with the shortest active history, active service life of anything that the US has ever issued. Even the Krag-Jorgensen lasted longer in service than the M14. This was adopted in 1957, production ceased in 1964, and the AR-15 would take over just shortly thereafter. So to answer, I think, one of the original questions, what was the problem with the M14? Well, it was quality control. It was fundamentally a manufacturing-based problem. Also, by the way, worth pointing out, in 1961, they brought on a third civilian contractor, TRW, Thomson Ramo Wooldridge. This was a large, diversified manufacturing company with no prior firearms experience. And the hope was they were professional manufacturing people and they could just take Springfield's TDP and make it and it would work. And they did, in fact, do a better job of it. They had fewer problems than Winchester and H&R. Still not a super successful program. TRW would go on to never make another firearm again, ever, after the end of this program. Winchester took a massive financial hit from this program. H&R took a huge financial hit when the M14 production was shut down. They were sort of bailed out. I don't know if it was deliberate. They were essentially bailed out by getting an M16 contract instead. Springfield Armory arguably came out the worst in this because Robert McNamara ends up completely shuttering Springfield Armory by 1968. Not directly over, not solely over the M14, but this was also the last gun that Springfield Armory produced, which I think is a real shame. I think the armory concept, like Springfield was set up for, is a very valuable one, and I think it is notably missing from today's military procurement small arms system. But that's a subject for a whole separate video. Ultimately, there were about 1.38 million M14s produced. H&R was the biggest contractor with 537,000 and change. Winchester did 356,000. TRW did 319,000. Springfield did 167,000. Give or take a few hundred. Ultimately, most of those ended up destroyed in the 1990s. About 450,000 of them were sent overseas as military aid or sales. The H&R tooling, interestingly, was actually sold to Taiwan, who manufactured their Type 57, which is a total straight-up copy of the M14. When it comes to guns in civilian hands in the US on the NFA registry, there are very few M14s, and that's because they were all fully automatic to begin with. And even if this is permanently converted to only semi-auto, it's still considered a machine gun by then IRS, now ATF. And so there are very few of them on the registry. There are basically 4 places that M14s come from in the US, registered transferable ones. One is the bankruptcy sale of H&R in 1985, just before the 1986 Hughes Amendment closed our machine gun registry. H&R went bankrupt and sold a whole bunch of assets, including a whole bunch of M14s. Well, not a whole bunch, a couple dozen M14s that they had on hand. We also have some interesting experimental H&R M14s. I did a video on an H&R Gorilla Gun a couple years ago. That came out of the bankruptcy sale. There was one disbursement from the Department of Energy selling, is like, again, 21, I think, M14s that were all early enough to be registered transferables. And then there are amnesty registered guns, which essentially are going to comprise guns that people stole from the Army and then registered in the amnesty in 1968. Nobody really, well, there's no easy way to determine how many of those are on the registry, but those are the 3 ways that completely intact original M14s are available on the US civilian market, and it's not that many of them. There are then also rewelded manufactured guns. So as M14s are being scrapped, the receivers are cut up, the rest of the parts are sold as surplus. This leads to 2 things. One is the civilian manufacture of a semi-automatic copy of the M14. These are the M1A. And the story of development of the semi-auto M1A is a subject for another whole video. This is getting very long at this point. But that leads to M1As for the civilian market, and it also leads to SOTs, essentially licensed machine gun manufacturers, taking surplus parts and cut receivers, welding the receivers back together, and registering them as newly manufactured M14s. And that's what this particular example is. So this is manufacturer on record here is Form 2 registration, which means someone put the receiver back together and registered it as a brand new gun. And I don't have any good numbers on how many of those there are, but they definitely make up the majority of the transferable M14s available today, just because there are so few that leaked out intact and unmodified from the military. So, that has been quite a long video here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this overview on the M14. In the future, I will plan to go over a lot of the sub-stories because there's a ton more information going on under the surface with the M14. It's all worth talking about, but it's pretty rare to find even a rewelded transferable M14. So a big thanks to Morphe's for making this one available for me to film. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.